The whine of the power drill was a high-pitched metallic scream that seemed to tear a hole in the peaceful mountain air. It was followed by a sharp splintering crack as the drill bit into the reinforced steel door jamb of my guest cabin. I stood on the porch of my main house, 100 yards away, my heart hammering against my ribs. A secure satellite phone pressed to my ear. On the porch of the cabin, Deborah, the president of our Homeowners Association, was supervising the operation. With a look of grim, righteous satisfaction, she had a locksmith with her, a nervous-looking man who was clearly out of his depth, and she was flanked by two large, thuggish-looking men in black polo shirts, with the word security crudely embroidered on them. Her own private goon squad. "Just drill out the whole lock," she commanded the locksmith, her voice ringing with the absolute certainty of the truly entitled. "I am the HOA president. I've declared this dwelling to be in violation and abandoned. We have a right to secure it. Get the door open." I was speaking quietly but urgently into the phone, my voice a low, steady current of pure adrenaline. "The perimeter has been breached. They are attempting a forced entry on the asset. I repeat, the asset is under direct physical threat. I have a visual on at least 3 hostiles. Request immediate interdiction. The gate is being rattled. And then, from the deep, silent woods that surrounded the cabin, they emerged. Not with a roar, but with a whisper. Black, unmarked SUVs gliding up my long driveway with an unnerving, silent speed. The doors flew open, and black-clad figures, moving with the fluid, economical precision of apex predators, poured out. They were a force of nature, a sudden, shocking manifestation of absolute power in a place that was supposed to be my peaceful retreat. The lead agent, his M4 rifle held at a low ready, his voice a calm, authoritative thunderclap that cut through the whine of the drill, shouted, "Department of Homeland Security." "Drop the drill. Get on the ground now," the locksmith screamed. And threw his tools in the air, falling to his knees with his hands on his head. Brenda spun around, her face a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. She saw the tactical gear, the weapons, the hard, unblinking eyes of the men who had just materialized from her worst nightmares. And that's when everything went wrong. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment. What would you do if this happened to you? And subscribe to HOA Files. To understand that moment of beautiful, glorious, and long overdue chaos, you have to understand my life before and my life now. My name is Mark. For 25 years, my life was a line in the sand. I was a senior agent with the United States Border Patrol, and then a special agent with HSI Homeland Security Investigations. My world was the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the border, a place of desperate people and dangerous cartels. It was a life of service, of constant vigilance, and of understanding the true nature of threats. When I retired, I didn't want a beach house in Florida or a golf course condo in Arizona. I wanted the opposite. I wanted a fortress of solitude, a place with high elevation, thick trees, and a single, defensible point of entry. I found it in a 50-acre parcel of heavily wooded land in a new, remote, gated mountain community called Mountain's Gate. I bought it specifically because it was the largest, most secluded lot in the development. Buffered from my neighbors by a dense, beautiful forest of pine and aspen, I built my house, a simple, modern structure of glass and stone. And at the far end of the property, tucked away and almost invisible from the main house and the road, I built a second, smaller structure, a guest cabin. But this wasn't just any guest cabin. As a final act of service to the department that had been my entire life, I entered into a confidential, informal agreement with my old contacts at HOA. The cabin, which I had built to very specific and very secure specifications, was to be a designated off-the-books temporary relocation site, a quiet, anonymous place for the government to house protected informants, debrief sensitive witnesses, or allow agents to cool off after a deep cover assignment. It had reinforced doors, ballistic windows, a secure, independent communications system, features that were completely invisible to the casual observer. For 99% of the year, it sat perfectly clean, perfectly stocked, and perfectly empty. A silent guardian waiting for a call that, for the first 2 years of my retirement, had never come. The undisputed ruler of Mountain's Gate, And the woman, who would become the bane of my quiet existence, was the HOA president, Deborah. Deborah was a woman who seemed to be powered by a mixture of boredom, suspicion, and an unquenchable thirst for drama. She was the neighborhood gossip, the keeper of secrets, a self-appointed arbiter of all that was right and proper. Her welcome to the neighborhood a week after I moved in was less of a welcome and more of a deeply personal and invasive interrogation. She showed up on my porch with a plate of cookies that were clearly store-bought and a barrage of prying questions. "So, Mark," she'd said, her eyes scanning my property with a kind of predatory curiosity, lingering on the thick woods that separated my house from the others. "It's a big, beautiful place like this, all for one person. You must value your privacy. What was it you did for a living again? Something with the government?" "Something like that," I'd said, giving her my standard, deliberately vague answer. "Fascinating," she'd said, her tone indicating she found it anything but. Her eyes then fixed on the distant roof of the guest cabin, barely visible through the trees. "And what a cute little guest cottage. What are your plans for that? You could make a fortune on Airbnb with the tourists who'd come up here. It seems a terrible waste for it to just sit there, empty." "It's reserved for private use," I'd said, a little more sharply than I intended. "Of course," she'd said, though the look in her eye told me she didn't believe me for a second. "Well, you just let me know if you change your mind. The community is always in need of extra space for overflow guests during the holidays. It's the neighborly thing to do." I had no idea that this was not a polite suggestion. It was a statement of her own perceived entitlement. The first direct assault came in the form of an email, a few months later. The subject line was, "A wonderful opportunity for the community." It was from Deborah. "Mark," it began, the tone a perfect blend of aggressive friendliness and absolute command. "I have some wonderful news. You know the Hendersons in the big house on the ridge? Well, their eldest daughter is getting married and they have an enormous amount of family coming in from out of state for a whole month. Their house is simply bursting at the seams. I took the liberty of solving their problem for them. I told them all about your adorable and completely empty guest cabin. They are willing to offer you a very generous $5,000 to rent it for the month. Oh, yeah. I have already negotiated the price. The HOA will, of course, take a small 10% administrative fee for facilitating this wonderful community arrangement. Please let me know where their guests can pick up the key." I stared at the email in disbelief. She hadn't just offered my house to a neighbor. She had negotiated a price and was planning on taking a cut. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it was stunning. I replied with a polite but firm and deliberately uninformative refusal. "Deborah, I appreciate you thinking of me, but as I've mentioned before, the guest cabin is reserved for private use and is not available for rent. I'm glad you were able to find a solution for the Hendersons, but my property is not part of it." Her reply came back almost instantly, and the friendly facade was gone, replaced by the iron fist of the HOA president. "I don't understand. It is empty. It is a waste. It is your duty as a member of this community to help your neighbors. It is very selfish and unneighborly of you to refuse such a reasonable and generous offer that benefits everyone. We have rules in this community about properties being used to their full productive potential. I will be reviewing the covenants. For the relevant enforcement clauses, the threat was clear. My old training, the part of my brain that had been dormant since retirement, the part that assesses threats and predicts enemy movements, began to wake up. This wasn't just a nosy, entitled neighbor anymore. This was a potential security threat. A person with this level of irrational entitlement was unpredictable. In my world, unpredictability was a synonym for danger. I had my lawyer, the man, who had handled the confidential agreement for the safe house, send her and the entire HOA board a formal cease and desist letter. It was a brutal, ironclad document citing my absolute and unequivocal rights as a private property owner, and warning them that any further harassment or attempts to gain access to any of my structures would be met with the most severe legal consequences. I had hoped that would be the end of it, but for a person like Deborah, a legal threat is not a deterrent, it's a challenge. She couldn't get in legally, so she began a campaign of psychological warfare. A week later, a formal violation notice was taped to my front door. The violation? maintaining an unoccupied auxiliary structure in a state of disuse. The notice went on to cite a new bylaw, one that had been magically passed at an emergency board meeting the night before. The bylaw stated that any auxiliary dwelling on a resident's property that remained vacant for more than 30 days was subject to a mandatory monthly safety and wellness inspection by the HOA's compliance officer, her husband too, assess for potential code violations, fire hazards, and vagrancy. It was a transparent, legally dubious pretext to give herself the right to get inside my cabin. The battle had escalated. I had my lawyer send another, even more blistering letter, informing them that any attempt by any HOA-approved agent to set foot on my property would be treated as criminal trespassing, and that we would seek a restraining order if the harassment continued. Deborah then turned to slander. She started a whisper campaign on the community's online forum. She posted veiled, paranoid comments. Has anyone else noticed the strange lack of activity at the big secluded house on Lot 42? Very secretive. And that second cabin, always locked up tight? Who knows what's really going on in there? Makes you wonder what some people have to hide. She was trying to paint me as a villain, a threat, to justify her increasingly unhinged obsession. And then, a week before the Hendersons family was due to arrive, the family she had promised my cabin to. Why? I got the call I had been half expecting and half dreading for 2 years. It was my old DHS contact. Mark, he said, his voice urgent and grim. We've got a hot one. We're pulling a key informant and his family out of El Paso. The Del Rio cartel found out who he is. There's a credible threat on there. Lives, we need a quiet place to hold them for a few days before they go into the formal WITSEC program. We need the house, starting tonight. The stakes had just been raised from a ridiculous suburban squabble to a matter of life and death. A protected federal informant and his family. People whose lives were in imminent danger were now being moved into the very cabin that my insane, obsessive neighbor believed she had a right to use for her friends. And that brings us to that terrible, beautiful afternoon. I knew the family was inside. A father, a mother, 2 small children. Their lives in my hands. I was on high alert, watching the security monitors I had installed. My old professional instincts screaming. At 2 p.m., I saw her car, a white Mercedes SUV, pull up my long driveway. She got out. She wasn't alone. She had a nervous-looking man in a locksmith's uniform with her and 2 large, menacing-looking men I'd never seen before. Her private security. She had finally snapped. She believed the cabin was empty, and she was going to force her way in to install her renters. The Hendersons family, who were probably scheduled to arrive any minute. This was a direct, physical assault on a secure federal facility with protected witnesses inside. I did the only thing I could do. I went to my office, picked up the secure sat phone, and made one single call. To the DHS Regional Command Center. In Denver, I used a simple, pre-arranged code phrase, one designed for just such a catastrophic breach. The gate is being rattled, I said, my voice calm, though my heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I repeat, the gate is being rattled. Then I walked out onto my porch to confront her. My own body was now a simple delaying tactic, a buffer to buy the cavalry a few precious minutes to arrive. The argument was brief and furious. I ordered her off my property. She shrieked about her rights, about my selfishness, about the cabin being an abandoned nuisance, and she gave the order to the locksmith. And that's when the world exploded into a scene of beautiful, glorious, and long overdue chaos. The black SUVs roaring up the driveway. The DHS SRT Special Response Team deploying with overwhelming professional force. The whine of the drill being replaced by the thunder of authoritative commands. Single quotes. Dodbro stood frozen on the cabin porch, her face a mask of pure, uncomprehending terror. She looked like a character in a movie who had just realized the haunted house she was breaking into was, in fact, real, and very, very angry. The lead agent, the team commander, a man I had trained with years ago, took control of the scene with the effortless authority of a true professional. His men secured a whimpering Deborah, the terrified locksmith, and her 2 suddenly not-so-tough security guards. their hands cuffed behind their backs with heavy-duty zip ties. The team commander then walked over to my porch, his face grim. "Mark," he said, his voice a low, angry rumble. "Talk to me. The hell happened?" I explained the whole insane story. The demands for the cabin, the harassment, the fake bylaws, the lies on the community forum, the final desperate attempt to break in. As I spoke, his face grew darker and darker. When I was finished, he just shook his head in disbelief. He then turned and walked over to a now sobbing Deborah, who was being held by two of his largest agents. He knelt down so he was at her eye level. He was no longer a calm commander. Was a predator who had just seen the sanctity of his den threatened. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "My name is Special Agent Torres. I think you and I need to have a little chat about your life choices." We gestured to the cabin. "You see that building? That is not a cute little guest cottage. That is a secure federal operations site under the protection of the Department of Homeland Security. It is, as of last night, an active safe house." Deborah's eyes went wide, the tears stopping instantly, replaced by a look of pure, abject horror. Agent Torres wasn't finished. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "You have just attempted to forcibly breach a secure federal facility. That is a federal crime that carries a recommended sentence of up to 20 years in a federal prison. You have also, through your reckless, selfish, and profoundly stupid actions, directly endangered the lives of individuals under federal protection in a major ongoing cartel investigation. That is another, even more serious felony, one that the United States Attorney's Office takes very, very personally." He stood up, his face a mask of cold, hard fury. He looked at his agents. "She's all yours," he said. "Read her rights. Take her and her associates downtown. I want them in a federal holding cell before I've finished my paperwork." Deborah was arrested. Not by the local cops, but by federal agents. The locksmith was detained as a material witness. The entire insane episode was now a major federal investigation. It's a matter of national security. The aftermath was swift and absolute. Deborah, facing a mountain of federal charges that would likely send her to prison for the rest of her life, was utterly and completely broken. The HOA, now on the radar of the Department of Justice for its role in the harassment campaign that led to the breach, was thrown into a state of chaos and terror. The board members, realizing they were all potentially liable as co-conspirators in a federal crime, resigned en masse. My privacy, the one thing I had craved above all else, was now, ironically, more secure than ever. No one in Mountains Gate dared to even look at my property anymore. The new, terrified interim HOA board sent me a deeply, profoundly apologetic letter, along with a ridiculously large basket of muffins, which I respectfully declined. This whole nightmare taught me a lesson that I had learned long ago in my old job, but had forgotten in the quiet of retirement. You can never, ever underestimate the capacity of a petty person, blinded by their own entitlement, to do profound damage. Deborah was so obsessed with a secret she had imagined that I was some kind of suspicious recluse with something to hide, that she ended up stumbling into a real one. A secret so far beyond her petty suburban comprehension that it completely and utterly destroyed her. She thought she was fighting for her right to be a nosy, controlling neighbor. She had no idea she was trying to pick a fight with the full force authority, the righteous fury of the United States government. Deborah's trial is being handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office, and they've just expanded their investigation too. Include the HOA's financial records and their private security consultants. Suspicious ties to a cross-border smuggling ring that HSI has been tracking for years.